Greetings, programs, and welcome to another episode of Thumb Wars Presents Blistered Reviews. This time around, we're tackling Atlas and Spike Chunsoft's latest offering, Conception 2. Buckle up, kiddies, because this is going to be one weird ride. There have been some out-there concepts for video games over the years, but one built around a male teen lead producing magical babies with the aid of a number of his female classmates so that said fantastical offspring can then be employed in the front line of a war against invading monsters is up there even for a medium that's produced the likes of Katamari Damacy. And yet that is indeed the basic setup for the new 3DS and Vita RPG, Conception 2, Children of the Seven Stars, which I suspect none of you will be surprised to learn originated overseas in Japan first, before finally making its way abroad. The idea of a Pokemon-esque game that replaces adorable monsters with newborn magical babies is a hard enough pill to swallow as it is, and the subsequent execution of this idea does not do the game any favors either. And this is one title that I suspect split fan opinion fairly heavily before all is said and done. The good: combat, star children, plentiful content, visuals, audio. The bad: story, characters, non-combat gameplay, menus. The ugly: the frequent exploitive over-sexualization of teenage girls in this game is pretty damn ugly in my book. Despite the 2 in the game's title, Conception 2 actually has no story connections to the original Conception, which is a good thing since that particular PSP-only title was never actually released outside of Japan. Instead, C2 posits a world named Atera, where 20 years before the game began, 8 massive labyrinth-like structures named dust circles appeared and began spitting out all sorts of monsters and other nasties. Fortunately, a benevolent being known as the Star God gifted humans with the Star Brand, a mark that grants those who possess it the enhanced bodies and magical abilities needed to slay the demons of the Dusk Circles. The catch is that the Star Brand will only appear on teenagers between the ages of 16 and 18 and disappears upon their 19th birthday. Furthermore, the Star Brand will not normally function inside the Dust Circles themselves, and so without any ability to strike at the cause of the monsters, Atera has remained in a state of stalemate ever since. Naturally enough, as Conception 2 opens, a star-branded young man arrives who changes everything. Once it's revealed he is the prophesized one known as God's Gift. This title means that the young man has the ability to allow both himself and one other to use their great gifts within the Dust Circles. And so, soon he is teamed up with 7 young women who also have some of the most powerful star brands ever encountered. And together, they are charged with entering the Dust Circles and slaying the great monsters that is the source of evil in each. And while all this is happening, dangers and intrigues outside the circles also begin to make themselves known as the final battle for the soul of humanity begins. You may have noticed the lack of mention of magical babies in the previous plot recap, and that's because ultimately these entities, named Star Children in-game, are actually largely irrelevant to the story of Conception 2. And yet the Star Children are absolutely the central element upon which the game's combat system is built, which makes for a serious disconnect between story and gameplay. That's just one example of how Conception 2 can be a giant disjointed mess at times. For a title with such an out-there conceit at its core, it's amazing just how familiar and well-tread the game's story and characters ultimately end up feeling. The game's male lead, for example, is a bland and forgettable would-be hero with little real personality of his own, while the 7 teenage girls who make up the rest of the playable cast rarely manage to ever overcome the harem anime archetypes that they clearly embody. It's a setup that's been used countless times before in anime and video games, and it feels creaky and old hat as a result. Although, credit where it is due, C2 does at least dial back on the constant catfighting that personally I've always found one of the more despicable tropes of the harem story. Nor is the larger plot driving the action of Conception 2 any more original than its romantic side, and indeed, anyone who has played a JRPG before will likely recognize the countless familiar tropes repackaged as plot twist coming from a mile away. But alright, being unoriginal is not in and of itself the end of the world, and indeed, I've often argued in the past, it's alright to revisit familiar ideas as long as the execution is strong. Sadly though, C2 completely fails to execute its familiar tale with any degree of competence, and indeed actually features some truly abysmal pacing all things told. It's almost impressive how the game's story manages to time and time again completely undercut any potential drama or excitement its story might otherwise possess. This is a game that introduces seemingly major plot points, like a rivalry between the main character and another boy, or a drug epidemic hitting the academy that all of the characters attend, only to completely resolve said issues sometimes less than 5 minutes later, and in as dramatically unsatisfying of a manner as imaginable. It's as if the developers at Spike Chunsoft decided to forego proper plot structure in favor of just randomly throwing events at players in the hope that something, anything, sticks. How else to explain, for example, one extended early set of cutscenes that crams what could have been a powerful scene of the player character revealing his backstory of watching his entire village being wiped out before his eyes by dust circle monsters on his older sister's wedding day, between 2 extended bits of puerile breast humor being made at the expense of 16 and 17-year-old girls. That's right, 2 separate scenes, completely unconnected to each other, both built around the idea that the difference in breast sizes is hilarious. When I played through this particular sequence, I felt like I'd been left with the mental equivalent of whiplash. And I literally could only just stare at the screen for several minutes, jaw hanging open, in sheer disbelief at the level of incompetence on display. This was Spike Chunsoft, after all, the same developer responsible for the brilliant 999 Virtue's Last Reward duology, after all. But I suppose such is the difference when a game lacks a writer and director of the caliber of Kotaro Uchikoshi. To return to the subject of the aforementioned sexual humor for a moment, Conception 2 is yet another game that unfortunately exploits the sexuality of its underage cast extensively. It is telling when developers prioritize boob jiggle over lip movement in the character sprites that make up the majority of the game's story segments, as it rather sets the tone for what is to come. Leaving aside the whole squick factor that comes from repeatedly featuring 16 and 17-year-old females in sexually explicit and exploitive outfits and situations, the game's near constant obsession with boob size and the like also leaves the characters feeling completely one-dimensional and the story lacking in any substance. For a game that is so clearly patterns itself after the surface elements of the Persona titles, more on that later, it's disappointing to see C2 fail to also embrace the Persona series' willingness to tackle and explore deeper and more thoughtful issues, and all in the service of supposed comedy that continually falls flat thanks to, among other things, a complete lack of proper timing. Frankly, between some of the outfits this game has its teen characters wearing, and elements like a groping minigame that uses the touchscreen, I probably would not have played Conception 2 if I were not reviewing it. However, I admit that's a case of personal values. But what isn't is the fact that C2's story is a dreadful example of a developer missing their mark at every turn. Assuming you can look past all of that, C2 is definitely at its best when it focuses on its surprisingly deep combat system. This is the area where the Star Children become important, as players will need to assemble teams of them before heading out into the dust circles. Basically, players will control 4 teams of characters at any given time in Conception 2. 1 composed of the player character and 1 of his 7 female allies, and 3 composed of 3 Star Children each. As a rule, the human team will have higher all-around stats than any single team of Star Children, who instead make up in numbers and diversity of abilities what they lack in raw power. Keep in mind that certain combinations of children will open up unique team attacks as well. Early on in the game, players will only be able to create a few classes of Star Children that range from physical attackers to magic healers. However, as the relationships between the PC and his teammates improve, and as they also gain new levels, the types of available Star Children will expand until players will have a vast array of possibilities when it comes to building their teams. Star Children tend to have fairly strict level caps, especially early on, and this fact plays into a mechanic called independence, wherein players release their now presumably full-grown Star Child out into the city to make their own way. Now, in story terms, this is just one more potentially interesting idea that the game leaves woefully underdeveloped, but in gameplay terms, it works terrifically. Releasing a child means players can no longer take them into battle, but in exchange, it raises the level of the city that players call home, which in turn opens new facilities and expands and grows existing ones. The best gear, side quests, Star Child classes, and more will remain forever out of a player's reach if they do not grow the city, which in turn helps encourage not simply relying on the same Star Children for too long. This is important because the limited growth potential of Star Children means that even a fully leveled Star Child conceived early on in the game will have no chance against later foes that will tend to be able to wipe them out in one hit. Just keep in mind that generally Star Children all start at level 1 when first created, so some grinding may be necessary at times to get your team back up to full fighting shape. The trick I found was to try and stagger what children I made independent so that no one team would ever have more than 1 fresh face at a time. A fast-forward button and autoplay with surprisingly well-implemented AI helps soften the blow as well, and players will not only be able to challenge a good number of smaller optional dungeons beyond the main dust circles, but can also take on more challenging simulations of previously conquered dungeons as well. Experimenting with Star Children can be fun, but doing so unfortunately also requires having to deal with the gameplay portion of Conception 2 that more directly ties into its story. By now, if you've been paying attention to the video that accompanies this review, the similarity between the look of the dungeons in C2 and the ones in Persona 3 and 4 will likely have become inescapable. Other elements, including but not limited to the game's soundtrack and enemy designs, make it clear that this is no accident. And indeed, Spike Chunsoft appeared to have done their best to outright copy that other successful RPG series as much as possible. Sadly, as it turns out, Spike Chunsoft is no Atlas, and what they've ended up producing is a clone that is by far the lesser of the two when compared to its inspiration. Unlike in P3 and P4, Conception 2 does not actually make use of a daily calendar, and instead time will not pass in-game until players actively select it to do so. Even exploring dungeons does not move the clock forward. So talking to other characters and exploring dungeons will not move the clock forward. The problem with this is that it undercuts the part of Conception 2 that forces players to spend time with the game heroines in typical dating sim fashion. Players will need to do this not only to deepen their bonds with the girls, but also as the primary and most effective means of generating the energy needed to breed Star Children. So, players will need to interact with the heroines frequently, but the game puts into play this bizarre mechanic that limits players to talking with only 3 girls at most, and never the same girl twice, before they must either visit a dungeon or go rest in their dorm room. Only resting in the dorm room does not cost money or energy or time, and so there's no consequence for simply resting endlessly between conversations. And it just makes the whole inclusion of this element of the game pointless. Along similar lines, each time players start a new floor of a dungeon, they begin standing on a magic circle that'll take them back to town instantly cost-free. Combine this with the fact that returning to town restores health and MP to full instantly, and players can return to the last floor of a dungeon they were on whenever they want, and it makes for an exploit that can drain much of the challenge out of Conception 2's dungeon crawl. After all, it's simple enough to just blow through a dungeon a floor at a time, using all of one's most powerful magic attacks to make short work of even the most dangerous foe, then after reaching the floor exit, returning back to town to then repeat the process endlessly. Even leaving aside its more risque material, Conception 2 has serious problems with its plot and characters, and undercuts its own narrative at every turn. The game's combat, meanwhile, is actually really fun, but even here there are problems, such as finicky hit detection, leading to the game often registering an enemy having ambushed a player from behind, even when it has not. And I could easily see the sheer amount of fighting the game requires growing tedious for some. And yet, there's something to C2's combat, despite such issues. And players looking for a solid turn-based combat system with plenty of opportunities for strategizing and min-maxing could do a lot worse than this game's 40 to 60 hour campaign. Also, while C2's visuals and audio unabashedly rip off Persona 3 and 4, they don't do so poorly, and the game's colorful visuals and often catchy tunes will no doubt appeal to fans of those games as well. Honestly, this is a game that probably deserves a 6.5, but in lieu of not making use of a 0.5 system, I'll be generous and round up instead. Conception 2 is something of a poor man's Persona that nonetheless will make for a decent fix for anyone going through withdrawal in the long wind-up until Persona 5 arrives sometime next year. I would just recommend downloading the game's demo first to get a full taste of both the good and the bad that awaits. As with other recent Atlus demos, players will be able to transfer their gains into the main title, so there really is nothing to lose from giving the demo a try if you're at all interested. Ultimately, Conception 2 Children of the Seven Stars is a messy game that is as likely to turn off as many would-be players as it will, if you'll pardon the phrase, turn on. Score, 7 out of 10. Good. Recommendation? Try it out.